Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another exciting episode. If you are building a modern cloud application, chances are you have already heard about Amazon S3. But there is a lot more to it, how it works under the hood, and more importantly, how to use it effectively in a .NET application. Well, in this video, we are going to break down some core practical concepts of Amazon AWS S3 in a clear and practical way. We'll start by understanding how S3 actually stores and organizes data, what buckets and objects really are, how permissions and security work, and why S3 has become one of the most widely used storage services on the cloud. Once the fundamentals are clear, we'll move from theory to practice, where I'll show you how to integrate S3 directly into a C#.NET application. Uploading files, retrieving them, managing storage, and building real-world functionality using AWS SDK. So by the end of this video, you will not just know what AWS S3 is, how to use it, how to manage it, but you will also know how to confidently put it inside your own .NET application. With this context said, let's get started. Okay, so this is the AWS console, and once you come to your home page, you can search for S3, and this is the scalable storage service in the cloud. We are going to, or the simple storage service, and we are going to open this, and over here we get this option to create a bucket. So I'm going to hit this create bucket, and then this is the actual configuration page where we could now create and configure our S3 bucket. Now, so if you see, my region is set to AP South 1, that is around Asia Pacific, Mumbai. And now we get two types of bucket. We could either create a general purpose bucket or a directory bucket. Now, directory kind of bucket is a special bucket. Okay, it is used for very high throughput and it is very much optimized for low latency. Or the only cons to a directory bucket is that it could only be deployed on a single availability zone. So for a single availability zone, this kind of bucket gives you a very high throughput, very low latency. So it is mostly used for payloads for AI and ML data. But for our purpose, for all general purposes, the general purpose bucket type is more than sufficient. Now we need to give it a name. So let's give it YouTube Harshit bucket. So if you try to give an underscore, that's not valid. That won't be a valid character for our AWS S3 bucket. So we cannot give an underscore over here. Now the next option is we can actually copy settings from an existing bucket, but for now let's not do that. Okay, cool. Next thing is the ACLs. Now what is ACL? ACL actually is the access control list. Now this helps you to set some ownership for your bucket. Now in AWS S3, and ACL is a legacy access control mechanism that defines who can access an S3 bucket or object and what permissions they have. Okay, so this is mostly deprecated. And why is that deprecated? Mostly because AWS now has things like an IAM permission. We can individually set bucket policies. We can block all public access. So this is the reason mostly ACLs are not used anymore. So for now, we are going to just disable this. Now its next point is the block public access setting for this bucket. So I'll keep it checked so that anyone with the URL just won't be able to access it because we have already blocked all public access. So let this be checked. Next up is the bucket versioning. Now we are going to explore more on the versioning, but for now let's just disable it so that I could show you something what happens when the bucket versioning is not enabled and what happens when it is enabled. So for now we'll disable it, but at a later point in this video we are going to put this on. Okay. Next you can add a few tags. So this helps you to filter based on tags value. So let's just call it is YouTube obj. So this key will tell me if a particular object in my bucket is a YouTube object, and I'm going to set the value to yes or no, or you could just totally remove it. So if this tag is present in an object, I will say that yes, this is a YouTube bucket object. Cool. Next up is the default encryption. All right. So now this is pretty important thing to understand. Now there are several encryption types. First up is the server-side encryption and Amazon S3 managed keys. So this type of encryption is where server-side encryption happens using the keys again, which are again managed by Amazon. Okay, so this is the most simplest type of encryption that we could have. Next up is the SSE along with KMS. So in AWS we have this key management service. You can put your own keys into it, and then you could ask Amazon to use those keys for doing some server-side encryption. Okay, now this is going to cost you money because KMS is another service of AWS, and you are going to ask AWS to use keys using that service again and then encrypt it. So you will be charged for encryption based on the access that you are using. So you will be also be charged for using the KMS here. All right. Next up is the dual layer server side encryption with AWS KMS. So this, as the name suggests, it will encrypt your objects twice. There will be a dual layer, as the name suggests. It will encrypt your object twice using the keys in your KMS. Cool. Bucket key. So this bucket key is actually helping you to reduce your cost with S3. Now let us say you were using this SSE and then you were also using your own keys in the key management service. So if you enable this, this is going to cache one of the key, make it very specific to this very bucket, and then every time it is going to use that key. So every time KMS will not be hit, and that will help you to reduce the cost. All right. So now with these settings done, let us create a bucket. Okay, so this is my second bucket, YouTube Harshit bucket. This is the one that we created today, that is March 4th. I'm going to get inside this bucket now, and we get several other options over here. Now, we are not going to explore all of these, but just a few very important ones that will help you to, understand S3 more. And then they will also give you the starting points for driving your decisions when it comes to several other separate tags over here. Cool. So first, let's go to this metadata. Now, see, you create a bucket, then you add an object to it. Now, each of the objects that you add to it, it will have several metadata into it, like its size, its creation date, the type of object it is. Is it a PDF file? So this kind of data will actually be stored somewhere in the AWS. And then next time when you want to query S3 and figure out, okay, what kind of data I have, you cannot just ask to list all the buckets, all the objects inside that bucket, right, all the time. That might not be a very good approach. Maybe you just want to have a look at all the PDFs file, or maybe there was a separate tag that you added to a particular object or to a particular bucket, and then you want to list only those kind of objects. So all that kind of information is actually stored in this metadata. Now, this metadata, once you enable this, you will have a few tables created where literally those kind of values will be sitting. So we'll do this actually. So I'm going to say create metadata configuration. Okay, let's not encrypt this. So we get two kinds of table. The first one is the journal table, and the second one is the live inventory table. Now we look at those things over here right now. So I'm going to stick with the defaults over here, and I'm going to say create metadata configuration. Okay, so now this table, you see this journal table, it is being created, and this one is also being created. So let's hit to refresh a few times, and yes, so these tables have been created. Okay, now where are these tables created? So these tables are created into some other service of AWS that is called Athena. So now let me just duplicate this page once, and now if I look for Athena, I go inside that, and over here in my database, this is my older bucket, and I should see this YouTube Harshit bucket. If I selected this, I would get these two tables. Now if I expand this, now these are my columns that I'm getting over here. So my bucket, key, sequence number, version, size, any tag, last modified date. And then there is one more table called journal. And over here we get this kind of data, checksum, KMS key, and all those kind of things. Now, if you want, you can add more columns to it. Also, if you want, you can just query these tables just like you would query an SQL table, right? So we're not going to do that, all of this right now, but we will instead move ahead and look at other properties that we could get using this configuration over. All right. Next tab is the properties. So before we actually start with the properties, I actually want to look at some other aspects over here. So let me go back to my bucket, and inside this bucket, I'm going to create a folder. Now I'm going to call this folder as YouTube, or let's just call it my channel. Okay, I'm not going to change anything over here, and I'm just going to say create folder. So now inside this bucket, I've got this folder. Now in AWS S3, folders are actually not physical folders on the machine. They are actually just a way to hierarchically organize your data. Okay, so this is just some kind of prefix that gets added to your objects that you will be adding inside this folder. So it is just for our understanding, but on the machine, there is no different folder create. So if I go to this my channel and let me add a object to it. So I've added a document over here. Okay, its name is Harshit_Agarwal.pdf. I'm going to say upload, and this is now present inside it. So now if I go back to my bucket, you would see that I've got this folder, and inside this I've got this file over here. And if I open this file over here, I would see that there are actually no versions to it, right? Because we did not enable version. So let's go back to our bucket, go to properties, and bucket versioning is disabled. So I'm going to edit this and I'm going to enable the versioning now. And now I'm going to come back to my objects tab, go to my folder and add a slightly updated file for this PDF. I'm going to add this. It has uploaded it. I'm going to hit upload now, and now it will upload it. Okay. And now if I go back to my folder, I would get this object, just one copy, which is the most recent version that I added to it. And if I open that, go to my versions tab, I would see that the most recent copy has a version ID, but the one that was already there is showing a version ID of null. Now, why is that? See, for the first time when we added the object, we didn't have versioning enabled. So any copies of that object before the versioning was enabled will have the key. But once we had the versioning enabled, we get a ID or the version ID for that new version of the file. So if I add one more copy of the same file, let me hit upload, I should now get two versions and one null version and one version with a null ID. So if I go to versions, I would see that there are two older versions and then there is a first copy that is with the version ID of null. So now we have enabled versioning also onto our bucket. Cool. So let's go back to this bucket over here, and we were on the properties tab and we have bucket versioning enabled. Now there are several other things that we could do, but you would of course explore it yourself. However, there is one thing that I wanted to show you, that is event notification. Now S3 has this ability that for a set of actions, every time that particular thing happens, you could trigger a notification. Now, these notifications will have a specific destination. So we'll not create it, let's just look at what all things do we get over here. So we have the following event types over here. So whenever an object is created, we will create an event of these put, post or copy thing. Whenever an object is removed, we could trigger these event. Whenever an object is restored, we could trigger these kind of things. So you can have a look at these kind of things. However, we'll again be looking at them when we learn about AWS Lambda functions. Okay. And there is one more part, that is destination. So every time one of the above event happen, we could send that event onto a Lambda function. We will specify the Lambda functions over here if we had one, or to an SNS queue or to a SQS. So these are the type of things that we could do. However, we are not going to do event notification right now. So let's just go back to our bucket. So we looked at the properties. Next up is the management side. Now this is pretty important, lifecycle. Now this actually helps you to configure the lifecycle of your objects in an S3 bucket. Now try to understand this. There is some cost associated with the kind of bucket that we create. So we created a standard type of bucket, and there is a possibility that you have kept some objects into a standard bucket, into a general purpose bucket, and over the time you don't actually need to access it every now and then. So this lifecycle management automatically transitions your objects to cheaper storage classes or delete them at a defined time, so that you would bring down your cost further. All right. So now let's look at how we can actually. All right. So before that, I've got this very interesting table again from the AWS S3 documentation. Now this tells us the different kind of classes that we have got. Now this is the S3 standard, the one that we use for general purpose storage and frequently access data. Then there is this intelligent tiering, which automatically helps us in saving some cost for data with unknown or changing access pattern. Okay. And then there is this Glacier class, Glacier Instant, Flexible, and Glacier Deep Archive. Okay. So now when, let's say, you have moved or transitioned your object from a S3 standard to this Glacier Instant Retrieval, the latency with your retrieval will start varying now. Okay. So if you have chosen a flexible retrieval, and you requested for some objects, you could get your object either in minutes or in hours. And if you did a Glacier Deep Archive, you will get that object in hours. Okay. So these glacial classes are basically for storing objects which are old, which you feel that you wouldn't be needing very frequently, and the person could actually wait for a few minutes to few hours in order to get that kind of data. So maybe for reports, for very old logs, this class of S3 is actually used for these kind of data. Now I'll put this link in the description. You can go ahead and read as much as you want about it. All right. But the cost will start coming down as you move towards the right of this table, towards the right hand columns of this table. The cost will start coming down. Cool. So let's get back and let's try to create a new lifecycle rule. And so I'm going to call this archiving rule, and we need to choose a scope for this rule. If you want to apply it to all objects, I'm going to say yes to it, and let's acknowledge this. Now there are rule actions. So for this rule, there are a few options that if you want to transition current versions of object between storage classes, now we clearly understand what are versions. So I want this. I want my current version to move to a different storage class. We'll come down and choose the storage. I also want non-current versions of objects between storage class. So versions which are older than my current versions, I also want to move them. Yes. Expire current versions, if you want, you could do that, or permanently delete them, or delete the expired object delete markers or incomplete multipart. Okay, so you can choose any one of these. You can read more about them if you want. Okay, now this is the place where we will set that. So anything that is in the standard IA, okay, so I wanted them to move to my Glacier Deep archive after, let's say, 60 days. So for 60 days, you create an object now, and after 60 days, I want them to move to the Glacier Deep archive, so that my cost will come down. And every time someone requests an object older than 60 days, it might take some minutes, or it might take a few hours to get that object, and I'm okay with that. So you can add these kind of things over here. Now this is for the current version, and for the non-current versions, you can do the same. I'm going to say number of days 60, and number of newer versions to retain, I'm going to say 1 to this. So I'm going to now create the rule. Okay, I should acknowledge this. Okay, and by default, objects less than 128 KB will not transition across any storage class. Okay, so now I can create this rule, and my archiving rule is now set. So this is another very important lifecycle management of an S3 object. Okay, so now we have one more thing that I wanted to show you. So let's go back to our objects over here inside my channel, and let me add an image. Let's see if I have an image. So I'm going to add this image as an object again. Let's close this. So I've got this image now over here. Let me open that, and if I look at the very top right corner, I see this object actions, and then there is this share with a pre-signed URL menu item. Now, see, there was one setting that we did which blocked all public access to this object, to all the objects in this bucket, right? But however, at a few times we would want to share this with a few users, right? But they won't be able to access it. Like, let's say if I copy this S3 URI and I type this, I won't be able to access this because I've blocked all public access, right? But then there would be times that I want to share this with a few people. So what I could do is I could use this share with a pre-signed URL, and I can actually specify for how long will this pre-signed URL be valid. So I can say it could be valid for, let's say, 1 hour, that is 60 minutes, and then I could create a pre-signed URL. Okay, so I've got this pre-signed URL. I'm going to copy this, and now if I try to access this, my image will be loaded. So this pre-signed URL that you are generating directly from the AWS S3 console or the AWS console, you can only generate some get pre-signed URLs. If you want to upload something using a pre-signed URL, you won't be able to generate a pre-signed URL from the console. However, from the code, we'll see how we can do it. But over here, you won't be able to do it. Similarly, we could generate a pre-signed URL for delete operations, but again, from the code, not from the console. Now, this is just the surface of Amazon S3, but all the major highlights, all the usual things that you will be required to do, the explanation is mostly about those things. If you want, you can go on further, explore other properties. And there's one more thing I would like to show you actually. Now, every time you come across a property and you are not sure what this means, you could click on this info tab and read everything about it right away. Okay. So this is actually very helpful. All right. So now I think we are pretty much done with the explanation part, and let's now switch to C# code. We will develop a new web API project and try to create, upload, delete, and all the CRUD operation basic ones we try to do from the code now. So let's switch to Visual Studio. All right, so let us open our Visual Studio, create a new project, look for API, ASP.NET Core Web API. Let's hit next and let's call the solution name as YouTube AWS demo, and let's call this as S3. Let's hit next. Let it be default. I'm using the .NET 10 platform. Let's hit create, and it will now scaffold a new .NET Core Web API project for me. And yes, it has come up. So let's go to the program.cs, and this is where my pipeline is being written. Now, before we actually move forward, we'll have to add the AWS dependencies to it, and we'll be testing it using Swagger. So we'll be adding swashbuckle.swaggergen to this. So let's go ahead and add those NuGet packages. Okay. So I will mention all the NuGet packages that we need. So let's first add Swagger. So let's add Swagger Gen first of all. Okay. And then let's also add Swagger UI. Now let us add AWS SDK.S3. Yeah, this is the one. Let's install this. And then there is one more package called netcore.setup. So let's install that also. Okay, so I think pretty much all our extensions, or sorry, all our NuGet packages are installed. Let's go back to program.cs and we need to add those services to our pipeline first of all. So after we have added the controllers, let's add builder.services add endpoint API Explorer. Then let's add builder.services add Swagger Gen. Okay. And now let us add the AWS options. AWS options is equal to, yes, builder.configuration.get AWS options. And now to my service pipeline or to my iService collection, I will add this default AWS options. Cool. And now let's add or let's register the AWS services to our DI container, that is Amazon S3. And yes, I think pretty much this configuration is all we need. And now after the application is built, let's add Swagger and let's also use the Swagger UI. Cool. So this is pretty much the configuration that we would need. All right. Now before we actually add a controller, I need to add one more service. Now all the AWS operations, all the AWS S3 operations that we'll be doing, we'll create a new service for that, and those service methods will be called from my controller. So there is some degree of separation of concerns over here that that we are trying to build over here. Cool. So let's add a new class and let's call this as S3 service. So I would need a private to read only Amazon S3 client. Let me bring the namespaces. Then let's add a constructor, and to this constructor, let's pass in the Amazon S3 client, and this my S3 client will be equal to this client. Pretty normal standard approach. First of all, now let's create a method that is actually going to create a bucket for me. All right. So I'm going to call this public async task, and the method's name is going to be create bucket async. So this is going to take a bucket name and a cancellation token. I'm going to create a request object. This request object will be of type put bucket request, and the bucket name should come up is equal to this bucket name over here. Now there are several other options that you might see over here. So if I hit comma and enter and I can specify the bucket region, but in our case, this will be picked up from the AWS CLI setup that we did. There's already a video that I've done around this. You can have a look. I'll put the link to that video in the description box. Apart from that, there are several other things that you could do. Now you can, all the configurations that we did on the console, we could also do it over here. But for now, let's leave it here. All right. Now, once my request object is created, I'm going to use my S3 client, and I'm going to say I'm going to use my S3 client, and I'm going to call the put bucket async method, and I'm going to pass in my request object and the cancellation token if it was cancelled. This is an async method. I'm going to await on it. And so this method for creating the bucket is done. All right, so now we have created this method, the service method, to create the bucket. Now we also need this service to be added to our CI container, to our DI container. So for that, let's just add it here, builder.services dot add scoped S3 service. Yeah. So let's add the namespace. Yep, cool. So now we need to have a controller which is going to call this service method in the action method. Cool. Before that, we would need some kind of DTOs to transfer data from the service between, from the controller to our service. So let's add a new class and let's just call it S3 DTOs. And inside this, let's remove this and let's create a new public sealed class, call it create bucket DTO. Let's give it a public required string bucket name. Cool. So now let's add a new controller. So let's open this controller. Let's add a new controller. Let it be an empty controller and let's call this as S3. So let me remove this index method and let's give it an attribute of API controller. Let's also give it a route, completely optional, but let's just do it and let the route be API/S3. Cool. Now we need a handle to that service. So let's add a private read-only S3 service and let's call it S3. Then we need a constructor and inside that, okay, so it already does the job. I love the code completion. Okay, let me copy this line. Let me remove this and let's use the rocket. Cool. So my constructor is set up and now we need a action method. Okay, so it is already suggesting. So let's use this HTTP post bucket. Okay, so I'm also getting this. Yeah. So now you see I've added this create bucket async action method and it is going to take this create bucket DTO. Now this is the create bucket DTO that we created. It is going to read the bucket name from that and call my method and then return me an OK. Let's also return the created bucket name over here. That just be DTO dot bucket. Of course, you can do all sorts of try catch and error handling, whatever you want. But for now, let's let it be just this much. Cool. So I think this is pretty much set up. Let's actually try to hit this and let's see if we are, able to create the bucket from our program. Now you might be wondering how am I actually able to authenticate to AWS? So we did this video on AWS CLI setup. You can refer that. So that happens magically. Okay, so my solution is running now and let's hit this endpoint. Let's hit this URL. Let's call my Swagger. Let's call the index.html. And yes, our S3 endpoint is now live. So let's try this out. So it needs a bucket name and I'm going to give it a name of my test bucket for YouTube. Let's hit execute. So yes, the code that we got was 200. So I think it would have created the bucket for me. And let's open the bucket now. Let me refresh this. And yes, we get the new bucket that we just created. That is my test bucket for great. Perfect. So this is running. This is working just fine. The authentication is happening. I'm able to access my AWS. Now let's move ahead and create a folder, put an object inside it all from the code. Cool. So this was the create bucket async method. Now let's create another method for creating a folder inside it. So let me call this public async. Let it be a task and let's call this method as create folder async. So now this create folder will take a few things. It will take a bucket name, then it will take a folder path, and then it will take a cancellation token as always. Now if we go back to our console over here, we see that a folder path has a /. However, when I would give it a folder path, if I go back to my solution and if I look at this Windows folder path, you would see that on Windows, the folder path has a /, right? So I think I'll have to replace the / with /. Okay. So now how do I do that? I'm going to say, okay, one more thing. So those prefixes can also be called as keys to our object. Okay. So I'm going to use the key. I'm going to create a new key over here and I'm going to say folder path and I'm going to say folder path dot trim dot replace this with this. Then let's add one more / at the end. And I think this should do the job for me. Then var request is equal to new put object request. I think it is doing it. Okay. This looks fine to me. And then I'm again going to call my S3 client and put object async. So this should create a new folder for me. All right, cool. Now let's go back to our DTO and let's add a DTO for creating the folder. Now this again is going to be, let me copy all of this on the top and let's just call it create folder DTO. It is going to have a bucket name. Then it is going to have a folder path. Let's come back to our S3 controller and let's create a new action method. So now we just call it HTTP post create folder. Let that be the endpoint name. let's add a new public async. Okay, so it is giving me, I think pretty much everything it is doing it. So let's just do a tab and let's add a closing braces, and I think I'm pretty good. So again, I've used this S3 and called this create folder async service method, and then calling it, and then this folder async method from the service will call the put object async method over here. So let me run this. Okay, so it has come up. Let's open this. Let's call the swagger index HTML. A create folder is coming up, and let's try it out. Bucket name. So the bucket name is already there. Let's go back to buckets, and this was the bucket we created. Let me copy this name over here, and inside the bucket name, let's paste that folder path. Let that be my folder YouTube, or let's just call it my YouTube folder, and let's hit execute. So yes, it has executed that fine. Let's go back to our AWS console. Let's open the bucket. Let me refresh it. Okay, it has come. So my new folder has come up over here, and it doesn't really has anything inside it right now. All right. So let's quickly add a bunch of functions to our solution, and then from there we'll be just testing it out. Okay. So let's do that. All right, so now let's create a new method that is going to upload my files from a local machine onto the S3, right? This is what we want now to do. So let's come back to this S3 service class over here, and let's add a new method called public-async task, and let's call the method's name as PutObjectAsync, and this is going to take a few things. So first up will be the string of bucket name. Then we would need the folder path or the key, and then we would need a iForm file using which I could actually attach a file. And then I would need some kind of dictionary to store my metadata for this file. Let me hit enter. Okay. And then I would need to have a cancellation token. So once I've got my required parameters, I again need to create a request, right? So where request is equal to new put object request. But before that, I need to put my file into a stream actually. So I'm going to say var file stream is equal to file dot open read stream. Okay. And now let's fill in the request object. So the bucket name is equal to bucket name, then key is equal to key, and then file. Now let's see if we get input stream is equal to file stream. Then we would also need a content type, and we are going to fetch that from the file. And then now let's add the metadata. So if metadata is not equal to null, then I'm going to iterate for each var key value pair in metadata dictionary. I'm going to say request dot metadata kvp dot key is equal to dot value. And then finally, I'm going to call my S3 client and put the object into it. And then let's also give the cancellation token. So this is how my S3 service for uploading the object will look like. Now let's go back to the DTOs and let me add a new public sealed record, or let's just keep it class, and let's call it put object DTO. Now I have already written it. I'm going to copy paste it. This is essentially what we are passing into that service method: bucket name, key, the file, and the metadata. Now let's come back to our controller and let's add a new method over here, and let's call it public async task of iAction result, and let's call the method as upload object. This is going to be a HTTP post method. The path is going to be object slash upload, and this is going to consume a multi-part form data. Now from the form, I'm going to read the put object DTO and the cancellation token, and let's call the dot put object async method, and let's give it the DTO dot bucket name, DTO dot key, then we need the file DTO dot file, and then the DTO dot metadata, and finally the cancellation token. Once I'm done, I'm going to return OK new DTO dot bucket name and a DTO dot key. Cool. So I think this should work. Let's actually try this out. Okay, it's running. Let me stop it. Let me run it now. Okay, so it has started running. Let me hit this URL. Let's go to swagger index.html. Okay, so I can see my new upload method over here. Let's try this out. It needs a bucket name. So my bucket name is my test bucket for YouTube. Let's go inside this. Let's look at the folder name, my YouTube folder, and let's call the file name as Harshad's first doc, and let's choose the file. Okay, yeah, I think this should be good. And it needs a few metadata. So also let's call it .pdf, or let's just call it Harshit's resume. This will make more sense. And now let's give it a few metadata. So the owner, that's going to be me. Let's also add some purpose. Cool. I think it looks good to me. And let's now hit execute. And yes, so we got the response body bucket and the file key. Cool. Let's go back to our console and let us refresh this. Okay, so I got this Harshit's resume.pdf over here. And yes, so it looks fine. Now, if I want, I can create a pre-signed URL also. But let's do this pre-signed URL now from the code. So we are back in Visual Studio, and let us now create a new method. Let's call it public string create pre-signed URL. And over here, it is again going to take a few parameters. Call the first parameter as string bucket name. Spelling is wrong again. Bucket name. The other parameter is going to be a string of key. And then we need the HTTP verb, whether it is going to be a get request or a put or a delete one. And then we also need an expiration time. Now, once we have done that, we will need to create a request body or a request object. So let that be is equal to new get pre-signed URL request. And this thing is going to take a few parameters. Of course, the bucket name, and then the key, and then the verb. Let's add one condition for delete. Okay, and this should be pretty much our request object. And then now we need to call S3 client dot get pre-signed URL, and we'll pass in the request. Yeah, so this I believe should be it. Now let's head back to our DTOs and create a new DTO for my pre-signed URL service method. Now I've already made a class for that. So it's going to take the bucket name, key, and the expiration time in minutes. All right. So by default, I've kept it for 15. Now let's come back to our S3 controller and add a new method for getting a pre-signed URL. So let's add a new method. Let's call it public sync task action result create pre-signed URL. And I think it has done it pretty well. And apart from URL, also give it a DTO verb so that we would know what kind of action are we supposed to do with this URL. All right. So now let's try to run this and let's see how can we generate this pre-signed URL. I've started the solution. Okay. So the solution is live. Endpoints are live. And let's go to the swagger index.html and we get this pre-sign endpoint. Let's try this out. So we need the bucket name. First of all, bucket name is this. Then we need the key. So the key is going to be this plus the name of the key, which is Harshit's resume.pdf. And then let's just try to get an HTTP. Okay, so let me just quickly look at the code once. What we have done is, if we get this, okay, so let's just put get over here and expiration, let that be set to 10 minutes and let's hit execute. Okay, expire specified is null. And why is that? Okay, so we have not set the expiration time over here. Okay, so expires is equal to, now let's try to run this again. Okay, so this is up and running. Let's go back. Let me refresh this. Let's come back over here. Let's try this out. Let me set the key. Let's get the bucket name. Okay, verb, let that be get, and expiration 10. And let's add a breakpoint over here and let's hit execute. Okay, so we get the expiration time and let's hit continue and we will get a URL over here. Let me copy this. Let's open another tab. Let me hit this and yes, I could get that file over here. Cool. So this works. Now let us try the same thing for delete and let's hit execute again and I can get the URL for delete. I'm not going to hit it yet, but if I go back to my console over here, go back to my folder, and I still see this object over here. Okay, so I've got this delete URL. Now I'm going to copy this and I'm going to open a command prompt and I'm going to call this request and then I'm going to paste my URL over here. And now if I hit enter, it should actually delete that, but I doubt it because it is giving me a few errors. But anyways, let us check. So let us do it one more time. Curl -x delete. Let's hit enter now and yes, it went fine. And let me refresh it again and yes, so that file is now deleted. Now if you want, you can also try a put object. For that you will have to try, maybe you can try that URL from a postman because you will have to actually send a put request every time you hit a URL on the browser. It is always going to be a GET request. So if I would have added that delete pre-signed URL over here, it would not have done anything because it would have browser would have sent it as a GET request and not a delete request. Cool. So I think this is pretty much about S3, how we can use it on the console, and then what all things we could do it from the browser, from the code. Alright, then this was it for the S3 demo. I hope you liked the video. If you did, please hit the like button for this video. Subscribe to my channel. It will be a real pleasure to have you along this journey. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, you stay awesome and stay safe.